safety fire system. We know you wanted to.
All right, I'll call the meeting to order. I'll call the 14th meeting of the Corporate Service Committee to order. This is a virtual meeting, and during COVID-19 emergency, City Hall is open to the public with reduced capacity and physical distancing requirements. Meeting can be viewed via live streaming on YouTube and the city website. The City of London is committed to making every effort to provide alternate formats of communication, supports for council, standing or advisory committee meetings, and information upon requests can be made. To make a request, you can, for any city service, please contact accessibility@london.ca, or you can call 519-661-2489, extension 2485. And to make a request specific to our meeting, please contact the csc@london.ca. That's csc@london.ca. I'll look for any disclosures of pecuniary interest. Seeing none, we'll go to our consent items. We have 6 items on here. I haven't heard from anyone if they wanted to pull anything, so now is the time if you want to pull something off the consent. Yep, Councillor Hopkins.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I know 2.1, which is the Capital Asset Renewal and Replacement Reserve Fund, we're going to be making some changes, and I wonder if I can ask through you to staff for just a quick review on 2.1. So with that, I'll probably ask to have it pulled.
So we'll just pull it and then we'll deal with it after we deal with the rest of our consent items. Does anyone else look to pull anything from the consent agenda? Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. 2.2.
Any other items? Okay, so we've pulled 2.1 and 2.2. 2.2 is an item that we have to make a decision on, so it's right that we pull it. And now we'll just vote on the balance of the consent agenda, which leaves us with 2.3, 2.4, 2.5, and 2.6. Are there any, oh, okay, before we make any comments, I will need a mover and a seconder. Councillor Morgan, seconded by Mayor Holder. Comments or questions? Councillor Morgan.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just wanted to make just a comment on the Corporate Asset Management Plan 2020 review. So I know that this is stems from the 2019 Corporate Asset Management Plan as the component that gives us the monitoring and updating. And I want to say I find this report very valuable to assess the state of the infrastructure, where we're tracking towards where the challenging areas are. And generally, it looks like a lot of work needs to go into this. And although it doesn't sound like there'll be a lot of comments or questions on it, I just wanted to recognize I think it's a really valuable process and report for understanding the condition of our assets and our plan to management.
Mayor Holder.
Thanks very much. Again, on that same report relating to the Corporate Asset Management Plan review, a question I've got through you, Chair, for the Treasurer. I note the 2020, I'm on page 45 for those who are trying to follow, that we have a gap as a percentage of replacement value, which is 2.98%. You'll note in 2019, it was 2.82. I'm trying to know if that percentage, that gap percentage, is as good a barometer as any as it relates to overall replacement value for how well we are or are not doing. So it's under 3%. How does that compare to other provinces, or is that even the appropriate checkpoint. I'm trying to understand if that measure is a reasonable one, not whether it's good or bad, but whether that's a standard that could be used. I wonder if I could ask the treasurer.
Thank you, Mayor. We'll go to Mrs. Barbone.
Thank you. Through the chair, yes, that is certainly one of the barometers we use to, based on some of the very detailed asset management methodology, and Mr. Shahada can give a little bit more detail on that in terms of how we look at that across other municipalities and look at that. But certainly one of the methodologies that we use is, are we investing sufficient to replace the assets and preparing for those when their useful lives come forward? So for a very significant period of time, municipalities hadn't been doing that, which is why the gap had grown quite so significantly. So it certainly is a very helpful barometer. I would say that the City of London is certainly in a very good position compared to other municipalities, but it's certainly, I think, the best tool we have at our disposal right now to look at the progress we are making. And it's certainly, when you look at some of the other reports that we'll be speaking about, the methodology of how we get towards that is also part of that strategy as well. I'll turn it over to Mr. Shahada in case he has anything else he wants to add.
Thank you. Through the chair. As Ms. Barbone said, it's a good indication for us to know how big is the gap compared to the amount of assets we have. The issue we have, there is no standard comparison across all municipalities of how to define their infrastructure gap. So I can't really compare us having 3% is good and bad compared to other municipalities, everybody having their own way. The new regulation is giving us guidelines in terms of how to define level of service, how to define our infrastructure gap, which will help once all the municipality have their asset management plan by the 2023 and 2024 deadlines. But it's a good indication for us to know how well we are managing our assets and how big of asset portfolio for us.
Okay, so Chair, I understand the methodology, but I'm trying to understand from our treasurer, is there a target gap? So if we're trying to understand our infrastructure gap and the amount of money that we need to allocate towards it, and ultimately come up with a replacement value percentage, what that gap is there. I just heard Mr. Shahad say that that plus or minus 3% isn't the issue, but I also heard you say, Ms. Barbone, that the amount that we're in reasonable shape compared to other municipalities. So are we setting a standard here so that we can understand what that percentage value should or shouldn't be, or is that just a poor measure? And if it is a reasonable measure, if we said to you, do we need to be between 2 and 4% to be acceptable, or 0 to 5, or under 3? I'm trying to get a feel for that. If you're able to give us any sense of that, please.
Mrs. Barbone.
Thank you, through the chair. So we have not set a specific target in terms of gap at this point in time. We are certainly, as we do our updates to our infrastructure, state of the infrastructure reports, we're monitoring what those gaps are and certainly trying to close them. The question is that, inflation, as we build new assets, are we investing in them? And so part of the answer to the question that you're asking about what is the right percentage speaks to the investment that we are setting aside, which is on the two part of it is in the 2.1 in terms of how we start to set aside the money to support the infrastructure gap. So ideally we would have 0 and we'd have enough set aside to invest in them. We realize that the investment is so significant, we will not close it. So the percentage that we're closing the gap is what we're measuring, but we haven't set a specific percentage because obviously the budget constraints are something that we're trying to keep in mind and have limited the ability to close that as quickly as we might. So we're using that as a measure to identify the progress we're making, but we haven't identified a target to close that at this time, but we're doing it slowly over the multi-year budget.
So Chair, I appreciate Ms. Barbone's answer. So thank you for that as well. I wonder, you know, we always look at, when we look at national figures, we talk about gross domestic product and certain debt obligations as a percentage of gross domestic product. And I wonder if at some point, without it being a make work project, if there is potentially ever any value going forward to try to, if that may not be the right measure, but if it's one of the helpful measures that as you go forward and you perhaps even look at it historically and what's manageable, that you might come back with a target figure. But again, not a make work project. And if it's a waste of time, I wouldn't, if it was a waste of time, you wouldn't have it here. But if it's not as useful as I'm imagining it to be, then we can let it go. That's it for me, Chair. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll go to Councillor Van Hulst.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm looking at this item 2.3. I think the mayor is just discussing the on page 45. It talks about our city's assets have gone from 20.1 billion in 2019 up to 21.3 billion in 2020. Now, that's more than $1 billion, which would be our whole city budget. So the assets we've not only invested, but I guess from this figure they must have also appreciated. So that's also a factor in our gap, is the appreciation of the assets for replacement value. Perhaps I could just have a comment on that from staff. How big a factor is that going to be?
Mrs. Barbone.
I will turn that over to Mr. Shahada to answer.
Thank you. Through the chair, that's actually correct. So there's two main things that contribute to this increase in replacement value. The new asset that we assume, for example, new roads, new subdivision that we get, and also the increase in the replacement value of the assets. And I'll give you an example for our roads asset. The replacement value of them has increased significantly over the past 3-4 years, which also contributing why we have a bigger replacement value.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I had a question about one sentence in here. It's sort of the second paragraph under that on that page. It says that to achieve sustainability requires either an increase in infrastructure investments or a reduction in the number of services or levels of service that the city provides. So I think that is that correct, or does it require both of those? And my other question through you is something else that might be a factor here is an increase in assessment growth. Is that going to make us more sustainable?
Mr. Shahada.
Through the chair. That's correct. So one of the new requirements for the regulation is we assess how much money we need to deliver the proposed level of service. So one of the ways that we can reduce the infrastructure gap is we reduce the level of service that we are providing. So we accept more roads, for example, in poor condition, more facilities and not up to standard. We're still going to do the safety, but reduce the level of service that we are providing. So that can contribute to a reduction in infrastructure gap. However, this is not really something that we are promoting. We would like to maintain the existing level of service or increase it, not necessarily decrease it, unless there is a direction from council that would like us to go to that direction. So the assumption that we have in the infrastructure gap and how to close it, we try our best to maintain the existing level of service. I hope this answered the first question. Can you repeat the second question? The assessment growth, yes. So the assessment growth can play a good role. We are doing a business case every year, starting from this year, to make sure any new assets that we get will be sustainable. So we are trying to mitigate the growth in the infrastructure gap because it's growing at a higher pace than what we can handle. So it will help, but assessment growth itself cannot manage or cannot address all the infrastructure gap that we have for existing infrastructure. It will help, but it may not be enough.
Okay, thank you very much. Madam Chair, unfortunately, I was having trouble connecting at the beginning. And so can you just remind me which numbers, which item numbers we're speaking to right now so I can ask the right questions at the right time?
Yes, Councilor Van Hulst, we've moved and seconded item 2.3 all the way to 2.6. We've pulled 2.1 and 2.2, and we're about to vote on 2.3 to 2.6. So we're making comments right now.
Okay, so 2.6 then. I had a question just about the horseshoe pitch had to be relocated as a result of this. Is that going to be reported to us as a single line item or just buried among other things? Guess I'd be interested to find out how much it cost us in the end to move a horseshoe pitch.
We'll go to Mr. Mantua.
Through the chair, it's Mr. Warner. I think I could be of assistance on this question. Yes, so the horseshoe pit, at this stage, it'll be part of the project cost. It'll be included in the project cost. We're still in negotiations on what proportion each party would assume, and the total overall cost, I think it's somewhere around $80,000, which we're again negotiating with CP. They will be paying for the land and then a contribution towards that cost.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Those were all my questions for 2.3 to 2.6.
Thank you, Councilor Van Hulst. I'll look for Councilor Hamler.
Thank you. So I think I have several questions, so just give colleagues a heads up. On the 2.3, the corporate asset management plan, I wonder if perhaps through the chair, Mr. Shahada could speak to what is going on in transportation and the outlook specifically for transportation. It's clearly the biggest driver of the infrastructure gap. And there's a couple areas there that are flagged as at risk of not meeting targets, and one that is already not meeting targets. I wonder if you could just speak specifically to where you think that is going and what some of the options are for containing the growth of the infrastructure gap when it comes to transportation specifically.
Through the chair. So transportation has been one of the biggest area with infrastructure gap since we first quantified the infrastructure gap back in 2013. One of the main contributing factors is increase in the cost of maintaining those assets in terms of replacement. So we have seen a cost increase of around 45% over the past 3 to 4 years in replacement value. So that's one of the major issues that we had. When you look into the customer level of service parameters that we have over there, and you're going to see a lot of them not meeting, it's really related to the target. We are targeting, for example, a pavement quality index of 65 for our roads. We are not meeting that. So we are trending towards, we want to trend towards meeting that target, but based on the current level of investment that we are putting, we are not meeting that. So a possible solution for that is we increase our investment in there. We always look for innovative way to reduce cost or adjust our target, except that we will have some roads that are not in good condition or fair condition. So we adjust our target a little bit. In terms of the other level of service metric, whether they are at risk of meeting or not, this is our first time trying to quantify whether we are meeting level of service or not. So we have adjusted a lot of the targets from the 2019 plan to make sure that we are communicating a proper view of the service itself. Over the upcoming years, up until we develop our next asset management plan in 2023 or 2022, we will be providing a more clearer picture on whether there's a big concern for any of the customer values that we have, and how can we achieve the targets for all of them.
Councillor Hammer?
Thank you. I see that there's a note in the report, in the scorecard, that says, the funding provided for the approved projects. So like thinking like the East Link, Rapid Transit, the South, and the Downtown Loop, those are not included in the analysis. So when those projects go ahead, to the extent that there are life cycle works that are going to be done at the same time, so we'll put in dedicated lanes on a Highbury Bridge, for example, and widen the bridge and also resurface the road there. That will be a positive benefit that's not actually included yet in where you think the infrastructure gap is going. Am I reading that correctly?
That's correct. We didn't do this analysis yet, but that's correct. That will help reduce the gap.
So you're going to do the analysis basically after it's done, and we'll see how much it's improved.
Not necessarily after it's done, but it may happen over the next couple of years.
Okay. I had a question about the property acquisition at 595 Adelaide, and through the chair, maybe it's best directed at Mr. Mountier. A bit of a strange situation here. I wanted to ask about the making Mr. Warner director retroactively quite a while in the past, and also how long we expect him to be a director until this business is wrapped up.
We'll go to Mr. Mountier.
Thank you for the question and through the chair. Yes, it is a bit unusual that the appointment will be retroactive. Unfortunately, the report should have come to the committee and to council at a time closer to the closing, but to a certain extent, that's a COVID issue. And so for that, I do apologize. I expect that Mr. Warner's time as a director of the corporation will be very brief. The intention is once he has been appointed, that he will be responsible for signing a transfer so that the title to the land is passed from the numbered company to the corporation of the City of London. At that point in time, his active duties with the corporation should cease, with the exception of the formal winding up of the corporation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mountier. I will confess that I was hard-pressed to come up with a question about this item, but I made sure I came up with one because I understand that you are on your way out, that you'll be retiring. And I wanted to make sure I got one last question in before that happened. I wanted to go to 2.4, just the corporate human rights report. I know there's a lot of ground that's covered here. And I wonder if Mr. Goldrup wants to give some commentary to it, because this is sort of the first one we've had since Reuben Tomlinson did their big review, and this is a important report for us. I just wonder if you want to provide a bit of an overview of what we're seeing in this report.
Thank you through the chair. This is an annual report that my understanding we've been producing for more than a dozen years, and it provides an update regarding inquiries, requests, complaints, and related training activities regarding human rights code of conduct, policies, and contraventions thereof. I think that the interesting part of this report, given the time frame of January 1, 2019 to February 29th, 2020, is that on March 1st, we introduced a new respectful workplace policy and protocol. So this report still uses the old template, and our next report will use a new template that's more in line with our new policy and protocol.
Thanks very much. I appreciate that.
Any other questions or comments? No. Okay. All right, so we've moved item from 2.3 to 2.6. It's moved and seconded, and we'll now call to question. Councillor Van Host?
Yes.
Councillor Helmer?
Yes.
Councillor Morgan?
Yes.
Councillor Hopkins?
Yes.
Mayor Holder?
Yes.
I vote yes.
Closing the vote, the motion is passed 6-0.
And now we'll put item 2.1, which is the capital assessment renewal and replacement reserve fund. I'll go to Councillor Hopkins for comments.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I understand how important our reserve funds are, and I know there are some changes that we're going to be making. And reading the recommendation, I understand we're enhancing and strengthening our approach, and it's a new approach. And I wonder if I can go through you and ask staff if they can just give a brief overview on the changes that we're making.
I will go to Councillor Barbone to give an overview of the report.
Thank you. Through the chair, just in terms of setting the stage for this. So the State of the Infrastructure report is really what has given us the information to be able to look at how we are using the money that council has approved to support our infrastructure. And a large part of that strategy has been through our reserve funds that we have been placing those funding and through our 10-year capital plan. So going back to the mayor's earlier question as well, where we look at the gap as a percentage of our replacement value, that really is the measure that we're using to track our investment over time and what progress we're making towards closing the gap. All of the funds that council has provided and invested in terms of supporting the infrastructure gap is then how we fund into our reserve fund strategy to use those funds to mitigate how we're going to fund those over time. So what I'll do is just in terms of the background, the infrastructure piece was really trying to understand what the gap is and where the investments needed to be made was our very first starting point to give us the information we needed to be able to look at how we're managing the reserve funds now to support the strategy, to support the various forms of infrastructure that we have an investment to make as we look at closing the gap. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Kyle and he'll walk you through the report at a high level just to show you how that all fits together.
Thank you, Mrs. Barbone. We'll go to Mr. Kyle Murray.
Thank you, and through the chair. So this report represents our second rationalization report as it relates to reserves and reserve funds since 2018. So the first report we brought forward back in 2018 was in relation to all of the city's various reserves. And the focus of that report was very much on reducing the number of reserves that we were managing and trying to achieve administrative efficiencies that way. This time around, as we've kind of looked at our capital asset renewal and replacement reserve funds, the focus has shifted, I would say, more to aligning our reserve fund portfolio with the corporate asset management plan, which you were just reviewing. So a significant recommendation of this report is to basically line up our reserves and our reserve funds more closely with the corporate asset management infrastructure categories that you'll find in the CAM plan. So we really feel like this is going to provide better transparency and clarity into the funding that's allocated into each various asset class. It'll give a better sense of what's being invested in each asset area, and hopefully lead to a better, clearer picture of the investments that we're making in that infrastructure. So that's one major piece of this report. The second major piece is really to look at target balance setting. And when we got into this exercise, it became very clear very quickly that there was no kind of clear guidance or best practices in terms of what a target balance should be for our capital asset renewal and replacement reserve funds. So what we did do is we looked at a number of different methods, many of which are utilized by a number of different municipalities across the province. And ultimately where we landed was working towards, over time, and I should mention that this is a long-term objective, is to work towards ultimately a target balance for our capital asset renewal and replacement reserve funds, representing approximately 1 year's worth of our average capital plan. So what that will enable us to do is to smooth out the fluctuations in our capital plan that inevitably happen from year to year. The capital budget is not the same every year, so having kind of roughly a 1 year's worth buffer allows us to smooth out that capital plan. And it also guards us against any potential revenue interruptions that that we could face down the road. I think certainly this COVID experience has certainly illustrated that revenue interruptions that perhaps we would have never expected to be all that likely certainly can happen and do happen. And we want to be in a position where we have funding set aside so that we can continue with our appropriate and important infrastructure works in the event that something like this were to happen again in the future. So I'll leave it there. Certainly happy to answer any specific questions that you have, but that's a high-level overview of the report.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. We'll go to Councillor Hopkins for further questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Murray and Ms. Balbon, for that information. Thinking back, I think I should have pulled the other item as well, because it would probably have made more sense sort of looking at the changes that we're making to speak to the changes in the review for 2.3. So it sort of makes a little bit more sense to me. And would we be getting this review or this report or analysis specifically with our infrastructure gap on a yearly basis? I wasn't sure if I heard that, or are we going to be looking at this more often than we have in the past? Just a question through you, Madam Chair, to staff.
Mr. Murray?
Certainly through the chair. So certainly the corporate asset management team includes any reserve fund balances in their analysis of the infrastructure every year. So certainly it's an input and it's considered in the calculation of the infrastructure gap. The capital asset renewal and replacement reserve funds, much like all of the city's reserves and reserve funds, are something that's also reviewed through the annual budget process. That is the opportunity to review not only the balances that are held in those reserves and reserve funds, but also the contributions and the drawdowns that are going to and coming from them.
Yeah. So it's ongoing work, continuous ongoing work that's happening here. Appreciate that. I do have a quick question. It's more about understanding the difference in amounts from Appendix A and Appendix B, and looking at the total city car reserve funds in A at 169 and in B 161, just trying to understand the difference there. Are they completely different?
Yeah.
Or?
Through the chair. So certainly thanks for the question. The difference you're seeing between Appendix A and Appendix B is primarily attributable to some of the recategorizations of reserve funds that we've undertaken or we're suggesting that we undertake. So there's some reserve funds that are currently categorized as capital asset renewal and replacement that are more accurately categorized as special projects and new initiatives reserve funds. So they are essentially being shifted out of this category into another category. And that's why you see the balance dropping somewhat marginally between Appendix A and Appendix B.
Okay, thank you for that. And just following up on the different reserve funds, different categories now, looking at the Urban Reserve Fund, does that fund deal with the trails, or do we classify our trail system as a capital project? I'm just wondering, or is it not considered at all through this process?
Thank you. Through the chair, I think the answer to that question largely depends on where the trails are located. So if the trails were located in woodlands, for example, then they would be covered under the Urban Forestry Renewal Reserve Fund. If they're in parks, then they would be covered more appropriately under the Parks Reserve Fund.
Okay, different categories. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions from committee? Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. I wanted to add, are we just dealing with 2.1 or are we dealing with 2.1 and 2.2?
We're still dealing with just 2.1.
Okay, I'll wait till 2.2.
Okay. Any other comments or questions? Oh, Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Okay.
Councillor Van Holst.
Yes, okay, one moment, sir. I've got...
Maybe you have two devices that are open, so you can mute one.
I do, and I'm struggling with that.
We can hear you well now.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. You can ask your question.
Okay. All right, so I'm hoping things are fine now. I had a question.
Councillor Van Holst.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair.
Yes.
I just had to throw my phone under
it's okay.
An item so I could speak. I have a question on page 9 and table 4. We're looking at the percentage of minimum target, and I see that our water rate is above the minimum. Our wastewater rate is below. What's going to happen in a situation like that? Are we planning to stay at the minimum target and move some of those funds into the wastewater? Will we reduce our rates as a result of that, so that the water rate balance isn't increasing? So I'm looking for some clarification on how that will be dealt with.
We'll go to Mr. Merrigan.
Thank you. Through the chair. So I kind of mentioned at the beginning in my opening remarks that the nature of the capital plan, not only for the property tax supported budget, but also for the water budget and the wastewater budget as well, is such that it's quite cyclical, and it has its ebbs and flows and goes up and down from year to year. So that balance that you're seeing in that reserve fund will largely be dependent on upcoming capital projects, particularly significant capital projects. So specifically in relation to the water reserve fund, renewal reserve fund, while the uncommitted balance for 2020 is projected to be 41 million, based on the approved capital plan, it's actually projected to dip to approximately 22 million by 2023. So there are large anticipated drawdowns coming up in the very near future that will rely on that reserve fund. So certainly it looks like it's in good shape as it relates to the minimum target now, but in a couple years' time, just simply due to the ebbs and flows of the capital plan, it will experience a significant drawdown.
Thank you very much, and sorry for the delay.
Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you. That's fine, Madam Chair, and I apologize for the delay.
That's okay. Thank you. Any other comments or questions from committee? Okay, I will need a mover and a seconder. Oh, Councillor Helmer.
Thanks. I wanted to just ask about it for 2.1, the sort of general principle of if your reserve fund is doing well and is like around the target of financial sustainability, we may reallocate funding away from it to help out the areas that are not doing so well and have not reached financial sustainability yet. I guess my question is around what's the time horizon where we're assessing that, and how often we would be sort of capping the contributions into one area and reallocating them somewhere else, because sometimes a lot of these things are based on the assumptions about how much things are cost. I'm thinking about what we've seen in facilities, for example. The facility costs all of a sudden have escalated pretty quickly. A reserve fund that looked like it was fine in terms of covering the cost of something could then be not close to covering those costs because the unit cost of building those things has gone up a lot. So I'm just a little concerned, and I guess what kind of plus or minus would there be around the target? Because I think in general it's an okay principle, but I'm a bit concerned that places that have done a good job of saving up might be penalized in the short term to help places that have not been doing such a good job of replacing their assets. And then there could be a pinch for those other areas, which they have a hard time covering. So I wonder if maybe Mr. Murray wants to address that, or Ms. Barbeau.
Thank you, so Chair. I'll start, and then Mr. Murray can add something if I haven't covered it all. So part of this will be done annually through the budget update and regularly through our 10-year capital plan. So as we had looked at, we are looking at average balances, and they are based on the 10-year capital plan. So each year we do update that. So I think, as we look at capital financing, that is always done historically across all the service areas, because that it still comes from the same place with respect to the taxpayer. So we do manage those typically on a very broad basis across the 10-year capital plan, across all services. So the intent is that when we know areas that are fully funded, that you wouldn't over contribute to those when you have a significant infrastructure gap and not enough money to complete a significant bridge replacement, as an example. So the intent is to review it in the context of the 10-year capital plan and through the budget process, so that we're able to address issues. And part of it is also with the other portion of the reserve that would be sitting there that is more generic, also gives us a little bit of that money to be able to support those projects. If there was something that couldn't be done, there still is a balance that is there to support those areas, in addition to possible reallocations. So the intent is on a corporate-wide basis, and I mean all of our assets on the City of London's books, that we're able to manage the infrastructure gap and start to look at how we can better support the capital plan as a whole, and to allow those areas that it wouldn't have otherwise been able. So in some areas, you might be very easy to close the gap because they're quite small, but something like transportation might take a more significant concerted effort to do so. And as the capital plan ebbs and flows, you might see some variability, but that over the 10-year period, we'll be able to adequately address those needs, and as council continues to support additional investment in the infrastructure gap.
Councillor Helmer?
Thank you.
So any other comments or questions from committee? Okay, we'll need a mover and a seconder for, moved by Councillor Hopkins, seconded by Councillor Helmer, and we'll call to question. Councillor Van Hulst?
Yes.
Councillor Helmer?
Yes.
Councillor Hopkins?
Yes.
Councillor Morgan?
Yes.
Mayor Holder?
Yes.
I vote yes.
Closing the vote, the motion is passed 6-0.
Now I'll put item 2.2 on the floor, which is the 2020 Reserve Fund Housekeeping Report, and I'll go to Councillor Helmer for comments.
Thank you. I've got two specific questions about two of these reserve funds. So the first one is the Building Permit Stabilization Reserve Fund. And I agree with generally what's been proposed in the bylaw, and I think it's fine. I am concerned about the tax supported contributions that have gone into that reserve fund in the past, and what will happen in a situation where we have a surplus. My inclination is to eventually claw back those tax supported contributions that have gone into that reserve fund. There have been many years where taxpayers have covered shortfalls in that area. There are fewer years, although they tend to be large, where there's a surplus. And I think the target being where it is now, or 100%, will mean that there's not going to be as many of these years of surplus probably. I don't think we're going to have as many opportunities to be withdrawing some of those tax supported contributions. But my concern is that in the bylaw, there's really not any contemplation that there would be that kind of a transaction. And so I just wonder if perhaps our staff want to speak to that, because rather than dealing with it on an ad hoc basis, I think probably having some kind of discussion around, well, what are we going to do about that? It's not a huge amount of money that's gone in there over the years, but if we could, over a 10 or 15 year cycle in the periods where there are surpluses, extract that back out of that fund, I think that would make a lot of sense, making sure that we've kept the balance and the target that's been established there.
I'll go to Mrs. Barbone or Mr. Murray.
Thank you, through the chair. So we've intentionally left the bylaw for that specific reserve fund pretty open-ended or general in order to provide us with flexibility for any circumstances that may arise down the road. Certainly, as you've noted, once we get to a place where that target balance has been achieved, then certainly there would be a conversation that would need to occur with respect to potentially, as you noted, clawing back those previous tax supported contributions that have occurred. And I would suggest that the appropriate avenue to do that would be through the annual report on building permit revenues and expenses. I think that would be a natural opportunity to have that conversation once we've achieved the target balance for that specific reserve fund.
Councillor Hammer? No more question?
Yeah, I'm just thinking. Sorry, that's my thinking face. Yeah, I'm not so sure I agree with Mr. Murray. I'm going to think about that right now. I think it certainly is up in the air, and my experience is that when it's up in the air, we kind of lose track of it, and unless you're keeping a really close eye on it, it's easy to forget how much has been contributed over time, and I think that might tend to kind of leave it the way it is and not ever result in anything ever coming back. So I'm just going to think about that, whether that's the best way to handle it, or whether we should put something in there where, if there's a certain threshold that's met, it would trigger some kind of report that says, hey, we've met this threshold. What do you want to do with this money? That might be an easier way of doing it. So I'm going to think about that. The last one I want to ask about is the red light camera program. And this one is not tax supported. And the rationale in the report for not having a target for it is that it's not tax supported, so we don't need to have a target. I would like to just hear a little bit more about the thinking for that. It seems to me like we wouldn't want a really large amount of money to be accruing in this reserve fund. Instead, we'd like to see it spent on road safety improvements in a timely fashion. So I just wonder if staff want to talk about that, because I certainly do have some threshold at which, that would be an unacceptably high amount of money just sitting in the reserve fund, and that it should be deployed. I'm not too fussed about it because I don't know that it's not a rapidly growing reserve fund right now. But I wonder if they just want to speak to that about not having a target for that particular reserve fund.
Mr. Murray?
Thank you, through the chair. So the councillor, Deputy Mayor, is very correct that there is no target being recommended at this time. However, as part of the special projects and new initiatives category of reserve funds, our intention would be to bring forward a suggested target balance as part of our next rationalization report that covers the special projects and new initiatives category of our reserve funds.
Councillor Hammer? Okay.
That's great, thank you.
We'll go to Councillor Van Holswell. You do your thinking, and if you want to come back.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and the Deputy Mayor brought up one of the issues I was interested in. So maybe just one final question on the red light camera reserve budget. Perhaps it was in here, perhaps not, but could staff just let us know what the present deficit or surplus is for that that fund, or is there amount that's sitting waiting to be put into that as a surplus? Or
Mr. Murray?
Thank you. Through the chair. Currently in the red light camera reserve fund, there is approximately a balance of $1.3 million.
well, I seem to be frozen. So
Councillor Van Hulst? Councillor Van Hulst? While we wait to get Councillor Van Hulst connected again, are there any other questions or comments? Okay. Do we have a mover and a seconder for this? Can we get a mover and a seconder for this motion while we wait? Councillor Helmer, seconded by Mayor Holder and Councillor Van Hulst.
I'm back on another device. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, so I think you missed the information that Mr. Murray gave. There's $1.3 million into the reserve fund for the red camera light. Do you have any further questions?
That's fine.
Pardon me?
No, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we have moved and seconded item 2.2, and I'll call to question if there are no other comments or questions from committee. Okay, seeing none, we'll call to question. Councillor Van Hulst.
Yes.
Councillor Helmer.
Yes.
Councillor Morgan.
Yes.
Councillor Hopkins.
Yes.
Mayor Holder.
Yes.
I vote yes.
Closing the vote, the motion is passed 6-0.
So there are no scheduled items. There's one item for direction, which is an application for issuance of proclamation for the Respiratory Therapy Week. I'll look for a mover and a seconder. Councillor Hopkins, seconded by Councillor Helmer. And any comments or questions? Mayor Holder.
Thanks very much. This actually may be one of the few proclamations that in committee that I am prepared to support, because they've made an effort, to their credit, to explain the London connectivity, which I think is clear to all of us. And I think that was one of the major criteria. And I'm not sure if that's as a result of the clerk, if the clerk has provided additional direction to our applicants to establish that connection. Not sure, because this is the first that's since brought that up again. But I applaud the way that the application went forward, and I'm happy to support it.
Thank you. I'll go to Councillor Hopkins.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I was just going to say that I'm pleased to support this public awareness during COVID, supporting our frontline workers. All these things are really important, bringing that public awareness, and fully support this proclamation.
Thank you, Councillor Hopkins. Any other comments or questions? We'll go to the clerk right now.
Thank you, through the chair. Based on the mayor's comments, I just wanted to point out that the application form has been updated to include an additional field for that information.
And I was just going to add that myself. So that was added to the application.
Thank you, Mrs. Saunders. Are there any other comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, we have a mover and a seconder, and we'll call to question. Councillor Van Hulst.
Yes.
Counselor Helmer,
Yes.
Counselor Morgan,
Yes.
Counselor Hopkins,
Yes.
Mayor Holder,
Yes.
and I vote yes.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 6-0.
There are no deferred matters or additional business lists, and now we'll go to our confidential agenda for item 6.1. And I will need a mover and a seconder for us to go into closed session. Councilor Morgan, seconded by Mayor Holder, and we'll call to question. Councilor Van Hulst,
Yes.
Councilor Helmer,
Yes.
Councilor Morgan,
Yes.
Councilor Hopkins,
Yes.
Mayor Holder,
Yes.
I vote yes.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 6-0. And I will note that the reason for closed session is on the public agenda. There is only one.